In this video, we're going to tell you the entire story of Starlight from the Boys comics. There are full spoilers ahead. Now that you've been warned, let's get into it. Meet Starlight. The first time we see Starlight is within the pages of the Boys issue number 3. Her real name is Annie January, and she's the most recent addition to America's premier superhero team, the Seven. Miss January hails from Iowa, and prior to becoming a part of this superhero group, she used to roll with a regional teen superhero clique called the Young Americans. Just for some context, guys, like the Seven, the Young Americans are also owned by a company named Vought American, a US-based mega corporation which has its hands in everything from weapons manufacturing to consumer-related products. And just for a little bit more background, the Young Americans is what you might call a small market team that mainly caters to the Bible Belt demographic. Now, the reason that we mention that is because when we first meet Starlight, this, well, starry-eyed girl had no idea about the inner workings of Vought American and the business of big corporate superhero IP management. That is to say, she immediately gets a rude awakening when she finds out that unlike the portrayal of thousands upon thousands of ad campaigns and media coverage that Vought American runs about the Seven, each and every member of the team is actually the exact opposite of what people see from the outside. To be more specific, the Seven is made up of some of the most evil, corrupt, and perverse quote-unquote superheroes on the planet. Just on her first day after getting inducted into the team, its leader, Homelander, along with fellow Seven members Black Noir and A-Train, pretty much blackmailed Starlight into doing some things she'd rather not do in order for Starlight to stay on the team. So yeah, you could say that any and all illusions that Annie January had about being a big-time superhero was shattered that day. And to make matters worse, Starlight meets her childhood hero and fellow Seven member Queen Maeve after the whole ordeal with Homelander and his gang, only for her idol to tell Starlight to take a hike when she tries telling her how much Queen Maeve meant to her growing up. If Starlight's introduction to the Seven proves anything, it's never to meet your heroes. Now you might ask yourself why Starlight didn't just quit the Seven. Simply put, Annie January chose her career and truly believed that she could help people. At this point in time, she'd rather go through all these horrible experiences than give up on her dream. Not long after her terrible day on the job, Starlight would find herself getting further harassed by A-Train during their next team meeting. Starlight would then see Homelander beat up the speedster outside the conference room afterwards. But if you thought that it's because the leader of the Seven suddenly grew a conscience, then you have one thing coming. The whole reason he reprimanded A-Train was only because someone from corporate was sitting in on their meeting, and it was a bad look seeing the team messing around with each other like that. Simply put, if you're a member of the Seven, you don't mess with the money. When Annie met Huey, sometime later, Starlight would have a chance encounter with a man named Huey Campbell while on her day off. She's just sitting on a park bench when Huey approached her, and well, they hit it off. The two started to bond over the pressures of their respective jobs, with Starlight being disillusioned upon finding out the Seven's true colors, and Huey recently getting drafted to and quitting a CIA-backed anti-superhero hit squad simply called the Boys. And you should know that neither Annie or Huey has any idea about each other's true identity at this point. They were just two simple strangers who met at a park like it was a rom-com plot. After their short conversation, Huey and Annie go their separate ways, with both of them feeling that good old spark between them. The all-new Starlight. Annie would continue her job as the superhero Starlight, but things just keep getting worse for her. The next time she goes to the office, Starlight would find herself literally being picked apart by Homelander. This time, the leader of the Seven proposes that they're gonna need to alter Starlight's costume to make it more marketable. He forces Starlight to ditch her old superhero suit in favor of a much more revealing one, a costume that can be best described as a one-piece bikini from Baywatch. Not long after her unwanted wardrobe consultation, the Seven would publicly announce and reintroduce Starlight to the general public in her quote-unquote all-new, all-different costume. It's at this point in The Boys where we get a bit of foreshadowing from one of the comic book's main characters, Mother's Milk. After watching Starlight's public outing, he asks fellow anti-superhero hitman Billy Butcher if there's a slim chance that one of these superheroes might actually be a decent human being. Butcher basically dismisses MM's query, but from a reader's standpoint, we easily get the idea that Starlight's that character, perhaps the only superpowered individual in their world who's actually good. Some time passes, and the next time we see Starlight is inside a church where she gets a moment to reflect. She recalls everything that's happened to her in between the moment she got included to the 7 and now, and none of them have been good experiences. Suffice it to say that Starlight has become fully disillusioned with the superhero life, and she starts questioning the beliefs she's held ever since she started donning the cape and tights. Where she once thought that she was actually going to do some good in the world, now all she can think about is how being a superhero is just about appearances and royalty disputes. Add the fact that she's pretty much getting harassed and bullied day in and day out, and you can understand why Starlight's become a little jaded. Remember when we told you that she used to belong to this regional junior superhero team called the Young Americans, and how they're basically part of Vought American's religious arm? Well, as we just saw, Starlight actually believes and embodies what the Young Americans stand for. Well, that's way more that can be said for the rest of her teammates, because if her time at the 7 isn't bad enough, Annie would discover that her fellow Young American ex-teammates were just equally as hypocritic. That's because Starlight found out that her boyfriend, the Young American member named Drummer Boy, was cheating on her with one of the other teammates, Holy Mary, when she walked in on them. In the present, alone with her thoughts, Starlight even starts to question her own spiritual beliefs, wondering if she's living in an unjust world. She just ends up having a breakdown and goes to the park. And in another rom-com-like scene, none other than Huey spots her crying on a bench. And in that moment, all Annie can do is find some comfort when she hugs Huey, and he welcomes her with open arms. They start talking again, and Annie vents to Huey about her job. Take note though, that they still have no idea about each other's real identity. In any case, Annie and Huey hit it off, and she even accepts his offer to go out for drinks with her later that night. That evening, Huey and Annie go to a local bar, and we discover that not only is she super religious, but she grew up very sheltered. She tells Huey that this is the first time she's ever had alcohol in her life, and unsurprisingly gets drunk after a few drinks. Huey then puts Annie in a cab to safely take her home, and at this point in the story, the tension between the two are off the charts. Annie actually is a little bit disappointed that Huey didn't take her home that night, but it just makes her fall for him more, given how respectful he is. The next day, Starlight gets to work and meets with Queen Maeve, who tells her that she was supposed to reprimand Starlight for missing out on the previous 7 meeting when she ditched work. Now guys, the thing about Queen Maeve is that she's the only member of the 7 who doesn't actively harass Annie. So instead of chewing out Starlight, Queen Maeve just tells her that it's all good before sending her away. But just as Starlight is about to leave her room, she notices Homelander and a high-ranking Vought executive named Stillwell pass by while they argue about why the vice president of the US, a man called Vic the Veep, failed to give his pro-superhero public speech that day. What you need to know is Vic is a puppet of Vought American. In fact, he used to be the company's CEO. To give you some much needed context here, Vought American's main goal is to become the US's main defense contractor, and they plan on doing that using superheroes as their main product.
And considering that Vic the Veep is owned by Vought, they're hedging their bets on the guy to become president and ultimately pass the law that would make the company's plans come to fruition.
Starlight hears the conversation between Homelander and Stillwell. He thinks that the boys have placed bugs around the building to snoop on Vought and the 7. To add to that, he thinks that there might be a mole within the company helping their enemies do this.
Before Starlight can hear any more though, Homelander and Stillwell are already too far down the hallway. In the background, Queen Maeve tells Starlight that she's noticed how the newbie's making a habit out of eavesdropping on other people's conversations. But this is Maeve, so she couldn't really care less about it.
Starlight, lover and a fighter. Annie and Huey meet at the park again and finally decide to take their relationship to the next level. That's right guys, they're now a couple. To celebrate the occasion, she and Huey go to his apartment. We find out that Annie's actually still a virgin, so Huey, always the gentleman, decides to take things slow. There's a whole scene here that we won't go through, but all you need to know is that it's one of the most hilarious panels you'll find in the boys' comics. Later that day, Annie's on the clock inside the 7's penthouse. She starts to think that Huey might want to break up with her after the whole debacle that happened to them in bed earlier, so suffice it to say, she's already on edge. She reaches a boiling point when A-Train starts harassing her as usual, this time berating her for failing to attend the recent team meetings. For the first time ever, she got caught here. Starlight snaps and fights back. Starlight's outrage even manages to impress Queen Maeve, but she keeps it to herself. After ripping A-Train a new one, Starlight walks out of the penthouse, but she doesn't feel better about what happened. In fact, now she's scared
scared that she's slowly turning into one of them. Not long after that, Starlight and A-Train find themselves getting assigned to scrub the underground lair under the Seven's hangar as punishment for Starlight missing out on the meetings and A-Train generally being an a-hole. There, Starlight discovers another dark Vought American secret. Under the hangar is the mindless, reanimated corpse of Lamplighter, the former Seven member who was reported dead and whose absence in the team ultimately led to Starlight becoming a part of it. Like the rest of the public, Starlight only knew that Lamplighter took a break from the team. She even saw him on TV before, perfectly healthy. Of course, it turns out that this was just another ploy by Vought and the Seven to keep up appearances. Because in reality, Lamplighter had actually died and was brought back to life using Vought's super shady tech, which resulted in his current zombie-like state. Starlight, being the decent human being that she is, actually pities what happened to Lamplighter. She asks A-Train why Homelander won't just allow the former Seven member to die, to which the speedster replies that their leader's using Lamplighter as an example of what happens when you fail to recognize how much of a threat the boys are. Make no mistake guys, cleaning poop inside Lamplighter's cell didn't suddenly turn Starlight and A-Train into friends. Hell, not after what they did to her on her first day. In fact, the two get into another argument after they're done with their assignment, which ends with Starlight verbally owning A-Train yet again. But this whole beef is not over. Oh, it's far from over. It all comes to a head just minutes after Starlight walked away from A-Train. Just as she's about to leave the hangar, A-Train rushes towards Starlight with his super speed and attempts to be physical with her. Of course, Annie might have made some poor decisions before, but she's no damsel in distress, so she fights back and uses her powers to blind the hell out of this scumbag. Their fight is cut short when Homelander and the rest of the Seven arrive back at their base, and he's not happy at the moment, considering that he just had a meeting with Butcher earlier that did not go according to plan. A-Train tries to spin the story on Starlight and paint himself as the victim, but Homelander is not having any of it. He's not having any of his members' squabbles today, so he destroys one of their jets just to prove a point and walks away, leaving Starlight, A-Train, and every other Seven member just frozen in fear. Later, Starlight pays Queen Maeve a visit in her quarters to try and vent about what almost happened to her earlier. Queen Maeve pretty much tells her that everyone in the Seven is getting screwed over eventually and how she's not really interested in being friends with Starlight one bit. But Annie doesn't back down and matches Maeve's energy, telling her senior that she's not expecting them to be close with one another, but she can at least offer Starlight a drink. And surprisingly enough, Queen Maeve agrees to this, inadvertently showing that she's got a soft spot for Annie after all. That night, Starlight and Huey meet at their usual spot by the park. She thinks that he might have been turned off with what happened between them earlier, but Huey reassures her that he's not going to change his feelings for Annie. Now, while all this is happening, Billy Butcher is poring over the surveillance footage they've gathered from the bugs they've placed inside Vought American. He sees Starlight in one of them, but he's no idea who she is at this point, much less about the fact that she and Huey are dating. Starlight gets found out. Sometime later, Huey goes on a mission for the boys to infiltrate G-Wiz, which is a Vought-affiliated superhero school, which can be best explained as a parody of Marvel's Xavier Institute, crossed with maybe Animal House. While having one of their usual toga parties inside of their frat house, the members of G-Wiz prank call the Seven. One of them hands the phone over to Huey, only to hear Starlight's voice on the other end. It ends up as a close call between the two, as both of them almost recognize each other's voices. Because remember guys, Starlight and Huey still have no idea about their whole Romeo and Juliet situation. Not long after that, during one of Huey's days off, he and Annie meet, and as you'd expect from the couple of lovebirds in their honeymoon phase, they make love. Afterwards, Annie inquires about Huey's actual job. He lies and tells her that he works in insurance, and when Annie asks her what he thinks about superheroes, Huey lies again and tells her that he doesn't really pay attention to soups. The next time we see Annie is during an event called Harrowgasm, the secret annual party that superheroes hold to blow off some steam. Now, Annie doesn't participate in the debauchery, but she's required to attend as a part of the Seven. While there, Annie asks Queen Maeve why Homelander and Vought had to go through all the trouble of lying to the public and announcing that all the superhero teams are going to fight some alien threat when they could have just held Herogasm in secret without all the smoke and mirrors. Maeve tells her that it's all business. There's There's nothing the masses love more than finding out their favorite superheroes are teaming up, which boosts sales for Vought. And as for why they do this party every year, well, it's simply because they want to. Later, Annie gives Huey a call since she's feeling extremely out of place in Herogasm. Her boyfriend asks where she is, but she does lie about it. It's all fair game though, because Huey lies to her in turn about where he is. The truth is, Huey and the boys are here at Herogasm too, since they're spying on the Supes and collecting more incriminating material against them. Sometime later, Vought American would try to push the Seven's sales again by trying to quote-unquote rebrand Starlight to cater to a wider male demographic. That is to say, Homelander and the company orders her to wear another new costume. Remember that Starlight is already wearing a revealing suit at this point. Now they want her to don a costume that looks like it was designed by someone working at Image Comics in the 90s. Specifically, Vought's designers want Starlight to wear a string. That's right, it's just a string that barely covers her and doesn't even provide the least bit of protection anywhere on her body. Oh, and they're making her wear high heels too. The rest of the Seven members poke fun at Starlight when they see this new costume presented by Vought's designers, but not Queen Maeve. Having formed a bond with her after all this time, Maeve starts to feel a degree of resentment for what the company is doing to Starlight. Later that day, Vought's designers force Starlight to wear this new costume, and there's no way we can describe it more accurately than telling you guys what Annie says when she sees herself wearing the ensemble, that she looks like a porn star. The designers basically tell her that's the point because sex sells and it will drive sales for Vought through the roof. However, the last straw for Starlight is when they tell her that they're going to reboot her superhero origin story as well. Instead of using her life story, they're going to create this whole narrative about Starlight being a victim who then becomes a superhero. Of course, this doesn't sit well with her, and Annie lashes out at the designers, telling them that they're pretty much glorifying abuse and using it as fodder just to sell Vought merch. She tells the designers to get out of her sight and ultimately decides, for the first time ever since she became part of the Seven, to rebel against the company and the entire team. She's not going to be their plaything anymore. Not long after that, inside the Seven's penthouse, A-Train sees Annie still wearing her old, already revealing costume and confronts her about it. The guy even prepares to get a little violent with her to force her into wearing her new costume, but Starlight isn't backing down. She reminds A-Train what happened the last time he tried this with Annie. Before things escalate, however, the Seven's most mysterious member and someone that most of his teammates fear, Black Noir, intervenes and stands between Starlight and A-Train. The Speedster backs off, knowing that he doesn't want to make Black Noir mad, after which the silent superhero grabs Starlight's new costume and motions for her to wear it. It seemed like Black Noir, like A-Train before him, was ready to physically assault Annie at this moment when Maeve came in clutch and stood right between them to tell Noir to back off. Sometime later, Homelander and Stillwell are having a conversation along Vought's HQ's hallway when they come across Starlight, who's now wearing her original, non-sexualized costume. Stillwell asks Homelander why she isn't wearing the new suit that Vought's PR team prescribed, but the leader of the Seven says he doesn't know and he doesn't care. Now, while all this is happening, Butcher is busy doing more research on Vought's superheroes, and he's taken a particular interest in uncovering who Starlight really is. A bit later, Huey and Annie meet at his apartment to, well, do what couples do. They also bought some adult videos to get in the mood. However, the video they're watching gets too intense for Huey, so he starts fast forwarding. Annie asks him why he doesn't like watching it, and Huey goes on a rant about how girls like that have loose morals and how he's not attracted to that type of woman. It gets really uncomfortable for Annie when she recalls what happened to her during her first day in the Seven, so she ends up putting her clothes back on and asking to go for lunch. So they go out and their moods change as Huey and Annie get all lovey-dovey again, walking around the city. Unbeknownst to the two, Butcher's also in the area, minding his own business. And by pure chance, Butcher spots Annie and Huey kissing from across the street. The boys' leader doesn't put two and two together at first, as he tells himself how lucky Huey is to find a hot girl like Annie. But after a split second, a light bulb ignites in Butcher's mind, and he's shocked to realize that Huey's dating Starlight. Sometime later, Huey gets an assignment which will have him go out of town for a few days. Annie sees him off at the airport, and their relationship takes another step when Huey professes his love for her. Little do they know though, Butcher has started to keep tabs on Huey and Annie after discovering that he's dating a member of the Seven. Later on, Annie and Huey talk on the phone, and she tells him that she's planning on quitting her job without really going into the specifics. Annie then asks her boyfriend what he'd think of her if Huey ever found out certain things about her past, and he reassures Annie that he's gonna love her no matter what. A bit of time passes and Annie finds herself inside a cafe as she tries to write a letter to Huey. It's basically a confessional detailing that she's part of the Seven and all the stuff that she had to do to be part of the team. However, Annie still can't bear the thought of Huey finding out about her secret life, so she ends up deleting the letter. And man, you can just feel how torn up she is about all of this. After that, Annie would find herself getting dragged by Stillwell to attend a superhero-themed church gathering called the Believe event with Homelander as part of their obligations to the company. Starlight protests that she wouldn't be a good fit to attend this festival, but the Vought company man basically tells her that she can't do anything about it. Both she and Homelander actually recognize this as a punishment from Vought. Nonetheless, the two superheroes do as they're told. Now Huey has gotten back to the city at this point in time, and it's here that things come to a boiling point when he and Annie go on another one of their dates. Huey tells her about how A-Train killed his ex-girlfriend, basically the springboard of the entire comic series. Hearing this, Annie's absolutely mortified. Her emotions run so high that she finally confesses the truth about her secret identity to Huey, that she's not only a superhero, but a member of the Seven too. Huey doesn't believe her at first, but she levitates in front of him, and to say that this was a shocking revelation for Huey is an understatement. He gets all lightheaded and sweaty as he recalls everything the superheroes have done to him and what he's done to them in turn as part of the boys. This makes him fail to even hear that Annie's telling him that she wants out of Vought and out of the Seven, that they're just some of the most horrible people on the planet, and the only reason that she was able to endure staying with them this long is because of how strong she feels when she's with Huey. In the end, Annie tells him that the only thing she wants now is to stay with him forever, but Huey hears none of this. The shock of this revelation makes him throw up and he hoops it away from Annie, telling her not to follow him. Later, Annie would leave several voicemails in Huey's inbox to try and talk to him, but meanwhile in Huey's home, he's just as torn up about things as Annie was before she confessed her real identity to him. Huey believes that he may have overreacted when he heard Annie's revelation and realizes that he's being a hypocrite too, since he's keeping a big secret from her, that he's basically a superhero hitman working with the boys. He snaps out of it when he recalls that Annie's gonna be part of the Believe event and the Butcher's gonna be there too, so he rushes out and makes his way to the festival, fearing that the boys' leader might hurt her. Meanwhile, Starlight gives the opening speech prepared by Vought at the Believe event. While this is happening, Homelander mentions to the preacher-themed superhero named Oh Father that Starlight is the only superhero he knows who wholeheartedly believes in the superhero ideal. During a break at the event, Homelander surprisingly gives Starlight some praise for having the courage to stand up against Vought when she decided to don her original costume and stand up to Stillwell. She notices Homelander's psyche unraveling in real time when he rants about how humans are beneath superheroes like him, but the leader of the Seven's monologue is cut short when Annie asks him what Vought would do if she decided to quit the team. Homelander's disposition goes from insane to misogynistic when he pretty much brings up Annie's first day on the team, telling her it's a shame that she's gonna quit the job after all the hard work she put into getting it. This makes Annie furious and she becomes more livid when Homelander tries gaslighting her about what he and the other Seven members did to her during her first day on the team. But Homelander recalls the gruesome stuff that he's been up to and has no real recollection of, and he backs down from arguing with Starlight. Instead, he just tells her to take the day off. Now, while all this is happening, Huey confides in Butcher about dating Starlight. The boys' leader feigns genuine concern about his feelings for her, but Butcher has plans, and he's one crafty guy. He manipulates Huey and keeps him within his grasp by orchestrating a way to show him surveillance footage of Annie's first day in the Seven, and just to make sure he can use Huey as an agent of the boys, Butcher even plays devil's advocate and tells him that Annie doesn't really have feelings for him. She's been laughing behind Huey's back all along. Meanwhile, at the Seven's penthouse, Starlight speaks to Queen Maeve and tells her how she's conflicted about leaving Vought and the team. On one hand, she can't stand the Seven and their horrendous behavior anymore, not to mention how Vought has basically turned her into their puppet. But on the other hand, Starlight feels that she has nowhere else to go, not her parents, because they essentially cut ties with her ever since she was born, and not Huey, since she knows that they're not on good terms right now. To Maeve's credit, she understands how Starlight feels and sympathizes with her. However, she makes Starlight realize that being trapped in this team and with the company is pretty much the only thing superheroes like them can do. It's a whole you're damned if you do, damned if you don't kind of deal. At that moment, Starlight receives a message from Huey to meet up with him at the park, and when she gets there, she finds out that the whole reason behind this is for Huey to act all high and mighty and berate her for everything she's done in the Seven, especially what happened during her first day there. Huey's just fuming and keeps on verbally abusing Annie, who pleads with him to hear her out so they can fix their relationship, but he doesn't listen, and it ends with one of the worst, bitterest breakups you'll see in comics. Starlight and Huey back together. Time passes and Huey ends up taking a sabbatical back to his home country of Scotland after breaking up with Annie and his role with the boys. Annie, on the other hand, ends up following Huey to Europe. She meets his parents, and when Huey sees her for the first time since their bitter separation, the guy instantly gets all aggro and tells Annie to get the hell out of their house. However, Huey manages to calm down a bit, so he and Annie start talking outside. She tells him that she only wants to explain her side of the story to Huey because she truly loves him and she believes she owes him that at least. Huey stays quiet and keeps on brushing Annie off, but she goes on to tell her story anyway, and at this point we get to see the exact details of Annie's origins for the first time in the series. Much like most of the other superheroes, she was born to parents who were injected with Compound V, the chemical that Vought used to create superpowered individuals. However, Annie has no idea which of her biological parents was the one who had Compound V in their blood. In any case, Annie's powers manifested the moment she came into the world, and given that she was a newborn, of course she didn't have full control of her light-based abilities, which caused her to accidentally blind her biological parents. Vought instantly caught wind of this and made a deal with her parents to sell her off to the company, which they agreed to. After that, Vought American basically turned Annie into one of their fledgling products. She was sedated all day, every day until she reached the age of 5 and could control her powers to a degree to avoid any accidents like the one that happened to her parents. And Vaught's childcare system, much like they do with other superpowered kids, gave Annie a couple of company-approved foster parents who essentially brainwashed her into believing that if she grew up to be a good girl, she was going to be a superhero for Vought. We also find that Vought American holds superhero kids pageants as a way to select kids that they can draft into their company's roster. Annie would go through this process and win the so-called pageant. She passed the test, and Vought American subsequently assigned her to be a member of the Young Americans. However, Annie reveals that the company doesn't really care about what superheroes do as long as they abide by company guidelines, which is mainly concerned with PR and brand synergy. Left to their own devices, Starlight and the rest of the Young Americans chose to actually behave like superheroes and start helping people. This eventually led to her fledgling team to be recognized by the media, which Vought American found to be beneficial to the company. This opened up tons of merchandising opportunities for Starlight and the Young Americans, which drove their popularity to the roof. And Annie reveals that it was at this point that she started to get hints that everything she thought about being a superhero was wrong. Annie grew up thinking that she was on a path that would have her actually be a hero, but found out through Vought and her experiences with the Young Americans that it's all just a business. Still, she held hope that maybe there's a place for her out there where she can fulfill her real dream, and at the time, she truly thought that this was within the Seven. As an aside, Annie even asks Huey how he didn't recognize her as Starlight when they first met, given that she's a famous superhero after all, and Huey just tells her that he didn't really follow the superhero scene at all. Anyway, she continues her story and tells him that getting drafted into the Seven was a dream come true, but when she got there, found out about the truth of these so-called world's greatest superheroes and had to endure what she did, all of her dreams and aspirations were shattered. Still, she tells Huey that she carried on. Annie finishes her recollection and Huey calms down a bit at this point, so he tells her that she can stay in their house guest room if she wants. Oh, but Annie isn't done saying her piece yet, because now Annie wants to know where Huey got the surveillance video that showed her first day in the Seven. He lies and says some rando sent it to him, but Annie's not convinced. She then starts throwing back all the hurtful things that Huey said to her when they broke up, and the guilt just builds up on him. Ultimately, Huey apologizes to Annie for being so unfair to her and overreacting about her revelations. The next morning, we find out that Annie slept at Huey's parents' house and they're on relatively better terms now. Huey asks his dad for advice and the old man tells him to stop being an idiot because he doesn't know how lucky he is to get someone as beautiful and as great as Annie. Later that day, Huey tells Annie that he meant that apology he gave her yesterday, but he truly thinks that there's no fixing their their relationship anymore since he can't find a way to get over what happened during Annie's first day at the 7. They fall silent for a bit before Annie confronts Huey about his double standards, telling him that she's out here pouring her heart out to him, but she knows that Huey's still keeping his own secrets. Instead of owning up to it though, Huey lashes out and asks exactly what Annie wants from him. It becomes oh so obvious that Huey is just clueless about how much Annie loves him, which she doesn't fail to let him know in that moment. She tells Huey that it would be such a shame if they let what they had going on between them just get ruined by that one unfortunate episode in Annie's life. Huey agrees with her and he finally admits that he does have double standards. Part of him wants to be with Annie, but he really doesn't think he can ever get over it. Annie asks him where that leaves their relationship, and all both of them can do is tell each other how messed up things have become. So for more context, you also have to be aware that Huey has become super conflicted, not just about his relationship with Annie, but with all the admittedly dubious things that he's had to do for the boys. Suffice it to say that his mental and emotional state at this point was unraveling. And it's here that we see Annie is the rock that keeps Huey sane. After a solo adventure where he and his childhood friends conducted a drug bust, he and Annie had another talk where he admits that he thinks he's become a cruel and hard man, which she denies. He also has hangups about being a crappy son who's not able to tell his parents how much he loves them. Throughout all of this though, Annie makes Huey realize that he is a good person, and in one of the sweetest moments in mainstream comics, she comforts him when he starts to have a breakdown on a bus where they're on their way back to America. So at this point, Huey and Annie are on way better terms than before, but they're not exactly back together yet. Starlight, Unchained. Annie and Huey get back to America and he tells her that he has to meet someone about work. This upsets her because despite what they've been through, Annie knows that Huey is still keeping secrets from her. Still, Huey won't tell her anything about his secret life as part of the CIA-backed superhero hit squad. They get into another argument about their relationship instead, and both Annie and Huey conclude that they're willing to work things out regardless of just how messed up things have gotten between them. Later that night, after Huey's meeting, he finally spills the beans about everything to Annie, and we mean everything from being part of the boys to having killed a superhero. Huey also admits that he's been an absolute jerk with how he treated Annie when he found out her secret, and despite being certain that she's going to want to have nothing to do with Huey after this, he pleads with Annie to get away from the 7 as far as possible. He doesn't get into the details as to why, but he knows that Annie staying with that team might cost her her life, considering that the boys are planning to make a big move against Vought and the 7. And in the end, Huey tells Annie that whatever happens, he still loves her. Sometime later, we find out although Huey and Annie are back together, things are not peachy between them. They're staying in the same apartment, but they sleep in different beds. One night, Annie asks Huey if they could just run away from it all and start over again somewhere. However, he rebuffs this and tells her that he might not like everything about the boys, but he's committed to fulfilling this mission with them, something that he won't get into details with her. Huey then starts talking to her about Butcher, and Annie easily realizes that he's manipulating him. She asks him why he wouldn't confront Butcher about this, to which Huey admits that he's scared of the man. At that point, Huey reveals more about his time with the boys, and by the end of their talk, Annie becomes more open to fixing their relationship as she invites Huey to sleep in the same bed with her. Time passes and Annie's relationship with Huey's actually mended, so much so that they've reached a point where they're ready to get intimate again. However, just as we're about to consummate this rekindled love, Huey receives a call from the boys informing him that he needs to work. But here's the thing, it's not like Huey's exactly ready to be intimate with Annie anyway. Just shortly after that, he and Annie try to make love, but well, little Huey can't perform because he can't shake off the image of Annie's surveillance video. And at this point, we understand it when Annie gets frustrated with him. According to her, they've lied to each other and worked things out, so she really can't see why Huey can't let himself be happy for once. All Annie can tell her boyfriend is to get his act together because it's already getting really tiresome for her. Not long after that, the world of the boys experiences a huge cataclysm when Homelander springs his plan to finally take over the government. He orders his cronies to attack Washington, which puts the US in a state of emergency. Starlight takes this as her cue to finally leave Vought and the 7 for good. Annie's just about finished packing up her stuff at the team's penthouse when Queen Maeve approaches her to see her off. Annie manages to convince her teammate to go with her as well. Anywhere would be better than staying with Vought and the 7. Surprisingly, it works and Maeve goes with her. But things don't go as planned when Homelander, who's now more unhinged than he ever was, appears behind them. He ends up attacking Maeve Maeve, who hurls away Starlight so hard that she gets hurled hundreds of feet from the Vought building to save her. Their duel doesn't even last a minute, and Queen Maeve is defeated. Now, this whole government takeover with Homelander would ultimately lead to his death, and the boys' comic book series jumps forward a year later after this event. After the 1-year time skip, Huey wouldn't tell Annie a single thing about what went down in Washington or any other details about his job with the boys. This ended up driving a wedge between them again, since Annie rightfully thinks that Huey still doesn't trust her even after all they've been through. So she decides to hop on a cab and leave. Huey pleads with her not to go, but she's not hearing it. Before leaving, Annie all but breaks up with Huey as she becomes open to the fact that things might not work out for them. Still, she tells him that when he's ready, and we mean absolutely ready to be with her, meaning when he's done with all his personal issues and his dealings with the boys, Huey should give her a call. Starlight's ever after. True to her word, after Huey was done with the boys, not to mention after a whole bunch of bloody, brutal, and status quo shifting stuff that happened to the world that we won't talk about in this video, Annie comes back 6 months after she left. In the final issue of the series, we see Annie and Huey finally getting the ending that they deserve as they get back together and profess their love to each other now that they, especially Huey, have gotten their act together and shed everything that's unnecessary in their lives. Now, the boys' original run ends here, but we get one last story where we find out what happens to Starlight 10 years after the events of the original series. We find out that Starlight has pretty much retired from the public eye and entirely dropped the Starlight name. She and Huey are living off the pension that he gets from the government after his time with the boys, and the couple split their time between living in the US and Huey's hometown in Scotland. Annie's even got accustomed to life in Scotland as she becomes close with Huey's cross-dressing childhood friend Bobby, too. Now, most of this story revolves around Huey finding Butcher's old journal that he wrote after his wife's death. He hides this from Annie, but she eventually finds out that Huey's keeping another secret from her, which is something that they swore they'd never do to each other after the conclusion of the original series. But we get to see that Annie has matured after all these years, and like before, she tells Huey to come back to her when he's done dealing with this matter from his past. Make no mistake though, they don't break up, she doesn't leave, and they don't have a big fight. Annie just keeps giving Huey the cold shoulder until he finishes reading Butcher's journal and discovering who sent it to him. Once that was done, Huey finally, and we mean finally, realizes that he's the only person causing his own hangups, so he gets over it and proposes to Annie shortly after that, and then they get married in Scotland.